After a week of nothing but horror films, your mind tends to end up in this kind of a place.
Where are they?
There's something in the blood.
By all the sins of the world.
Welcome back to Game Over Movie Reviews. My name's Peter, and today I'm going to be giving you more bang for your buck with not one, not two, not three, but 15 mini reviews of all the horror films I watched during what I cleverly called
My Horror Week.
Last week I took the whole week off work. My horror-hating girlfriend was away with her children, so I had the whole house, and more importantly, the television to myself. I decided, because I'm a bit of a masochist, that I would watch nothing but horror films throughout the entire week, including a few rewatches of some old favourites and films I haven't seen for a while, one big new release at the cinema, and a few first-time watches. So I have 15 short reviews for you, and I've chaptered them below so you can skip ahead if you want to, but don't do that, watch it all. And the week started with what I think is a first for me, 2 films back-to-back at the cinema, A Quiet Place and A Quiet Place Part 2. Yes, the first film of my horror week was John Krasinski's masterful A Quiet Place. This, I believe, is the third time I've seen this film. I did catch it first time round in the cinema, and I think I like it a little bit more every time I see it. I really think this film should be shown in film school to show how to make a plot with no fat on the bones. It's so taut and so brilliantly crafted, and not 1 second of this film is wasted. The plot, characters, world building and backstory are given to us in the simplest way possible. Nothing is superfluous, nothing is overtly heavy-handed. And the creature design is absolutely excellent, and it was a masterstroke to make ultra hearing their strength. This means that the Abbott family are always in jeopardy. You have constant drama and tension without needing to resort to plot contrivances, though I do question that scene with the upward-facing nail. I mean, I'm not very good at DIY myself, but I do know if you put a nail in something, you should probably put the point away from where it can be trodden on. The cast are fantastic, and it's great to see child actors who actually steal the show and not just support it. Millicent Simmons is especially good. And is there a better looking couple in Hollywood right now than Emily Blunt and John Krasinski? I don't think so. My score for A Quiet Place is 9 out of 10.
Mom! Oh my God!
So I can tell you watching 2 films like A Quiet Place and A Quiet Place Part 2 back to back is surprisingly tiring. I was absolutely knackered after watching these 2 films, but I suppose I am old. But it was totally worth it because Part 2 is an absolutely excellent follow-up which doesn't quite hit the heights of the original. There are some big pros here though. The cast is even better than the first film, especially the 2 kids who are superb, with Millicent Simmons now effectively carrying most of the film. She is so good. Great to see Cillian Murphy back in the post-apocalypse too, and more on that later. 28 days later, I hear you ask? No, just a few minutes. You don't have to wait that long. The plot of A Quiet Place Part 2 is once again very simple, very economically told, and the pace is excellent throughout. That extended prologue was badass too, and really shows that Krasinski is a fine director with a big future ahead of him. There are some cons with A Quiet Place Part 2 though. It felt a little bit episodic. I think this is by design, but it feels a little bit like you're watching a grand TV series at the cinema. And this is very much compounded by a sudden and quite unfulfilling ending. At times the film felt just a touch rushed in an effort to keep that pacing going. Certain characters don't quite get enough screen time, and there was one moment in particular where I felt the film could have taken the foot off the pedal for just 5 minutes. I also felt there were more instances in this sequel where characters did slightly silly things to move the plot on, which is something you always see in these kind of films, apart from, you guessed it, A Quiet Place. However, A Quiet Place Part 2 is a very strong follow-up, and I'm looking forward to a Part 3 which has just been announced with Jeff Nichols writing and directed from an idea from Krasinski. My score for A Quiet Place Part 2 is 8 out of 10. The next film I chose to watch was a rewatch prompted by the release of Spiral, and that film is of course 2004's Saw.
Hello, Adam. Dr. Gordon. I want to play a game.
I was absolutely shocked at how poorly this film stands up. Obviously it was mega low budget and kind of thrown together, but I'm sure I remember this film being stronger than this. The acting across the board is abysmal. Cary Elwes is not a great serious actor, and he makes some of that last 10 minutes near comical, and yet he looks like Daniel Day-Lewis next to Lee Winnell. The man sure can write and direct, but please, no more acting. And even the ever-reliable Danny Glover is goofy as hell in this film. You can see a lot of early visual promise here from James Wan as a director, but I don't think he was quite there in terms of a performance director at this stage. The crazy editing and some of the directorial choices have aged this film quite poorly as well. What shocked me the most on this rewatch, though, was the story and its mystery. I just didn't find it very interesting or very mysterious or very anything, really. I remember being shocked at the end of Saw when I first saw it, and it is admittedly a cool reveal that you don't see coming, but that reveal doesn't bring the story together. It's kind of a, oh wow, hang on, so what kind of moment. It's a reveal and not a payoff. My score for Saw is a probably generous and nostalgic 6 out of 10. Up next was the Japanese film Pulse from 2001. Written and directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa, Pulse tells the story of two groups of people who discover evidence that suggests spirits may be trying to invade the human world through the internet. Yeah, and this one just wasn't quite for me. Other than some genuinely creepy moments, an ominous sense of dread throughout, and a really cool score, I found this quite incoherent and unengaging. Like with a lot of Japanese horror films, there's a boatload of exposition here, but it doesn't really do anything to explain what's going on in this film. I never truly understood what was happening to people and what the actual supernatural menace was all about. What was the threat? Add to that some pretty dull COD philosophy on death, a batch of nondescript characters, stodgy pacing and an overly long runtime meant that I was sadly bored quite a lot, especially in the second half. This was a film I was on board with less and less as the runtime ticked by. Yes, it does have some scary scenes, one particularly brilliant scene in a basement, but as the film went on, I just got a little bit bored. My score for Pulse is 5 out of 10. Back to familiar territory with film number 5 of my horror week, it's Neil Marshall's absolute stunner, The Descent.
There's only one way out of this chamber, and that's down the pipe.
This has got to be one of the best horrors of the past 20 years. So much about The Descent works brilliantly. The pacing, the characters, the setting, the creatures, the gore. What really makes this film excel, though, is that it's really scary way before you even know there are monsters involved. Some people are afraid of clowns, some people don't like dolls. What scares us is very subjective, but I don't think you could find a single person who wouldn't be terrified to be trapped underground in a series of narrow, unmapped caves. The drama between the characters here works really well too. There are a few little pockets of mistrust, some things unsaid bubbling under the surface. The all-female set of characters don't quite have each other's backs, which does ramp up the tension when the shit hits the fan. And The Descent features a rope burn scene which makes my entire body wince. Neil Marshall has never got close to The Descent before or since, and I doubt he ever will. My score for The Descent is 8.5 out of 10. Next up was 2007's Inside, aka Alanteria, written and directed by Alexandra Bustillo and Julianne Mari. 4 months after the death of her husband, a woman on the brink of motherhood is tormented in her home by a strange woman who wants her unborn baby. And no, I did not like this one. I don't have much positive to say about Inside. The gore is effective for the most part, though not always, and I feel the film is purely a gore showcase and little else. The protagonist and antagonist are shallow and dull. The setting is restrictive, which means the film is very repetitive, and the plot is paper thin with a reveal coming towards the end, which can't have been a surprise to anyone. This is definitely my least favourite film I've seen from this era of extreme French horror, more of that later, and I don't really understand the popularity of this one. I'd say this was the only real low point of my horror week. My score for Inside is 3.5 out of 10. Back to Cillian Murphy in the apocalypse now with 28 Days Later. I've always liked how this is filmed to look like a BBC drama from the 80s. Never been sure if that was a stylistic choice or a question of budget or convenience, but it definitely has the vibe of The Day of the Triffids, which I absolutely love. I really like that low frame rate method they use for shooting action, especially when coupled with the rain. It somehow makes the infected more frightening. You can see them fairly clearly, but they're almost too frenetic and rage-induced for you to be able to see them properly to make them out. Some of the acting, however, is very hokey, particularly the girl Hannah with her strange Cockney, Australian, wherever the hell it's meant to be from accent. The bit where her dad gets infected and then shot by the soldiers and she goes, "Dad?" It really makes me laugh. It's so bad. The soldiers at the end are very comic book villain too, and not at all believable, with Christopher Eccleston chewing up the scenery. But there are lots of really kick-ass scenes which are still exciting now, even though I've seen this probably 4 or 5 times. The tunnel scene is particularly good and very memorable, and I also love the track from the score, In the House in a Heartbeat. It's goosebump inducing. My score for 28 Days Later is 7.5 out of 10. Another British horror up next with my first watch of 2008's Eden Lake.
It's beautiful.
Eden Lake was written and directed by James Watkins, and it stars Kaylee Riley and Michael Fassbender. Refusing to let anything spoil their romantic weekend break, a young couple confront a gang of loutish youths with terrifyingly brutal consequences. I've always avoided this one because it kind of looks trashy. I don't think the poster or the marketing give away the right vibe of this film, because I thought this one was pretty different and surprisingly strong. Eden Lake works so well because it feels real. We've all had run-ins with these kind of people, although hopefully not to this level, so there's an element of being able to relate in some way. I like how long the film takes to build up its tension, and when it's released it keeps it relatively grounded. There are a couple of silly missteps, but I thought the script was sharp, the cast pretty solid, and the ending, although inevitable to a certain extent, felt earned and the best way to round it off. I know that some people won't agree with that. That ending is controversial. My score for Eden Lake is 7 out of 10. If you were to have your own horror week, what films would you pick to watch or rewatch? And how many films out of these 15 are you yet to see? And the ones you've seen, which is your favourite? And I'm hoping to do this again sometime, maybe another horror week, maybe my comedy week, my action week. So if you're interested in joining in, let me know in the comments below. If watching horror films all week is something that appeals to you, please hit that subscribe button and stick around for more mini reviews. And if you like this video, please like this video. Because I'd watched 28 Days Later, and because I'd seen it for some time, I kind of had to watch 28 Weeks Later.
Welcome to London.
So this one's not quite as good as the first film, but it's not far off. I like that this is a different film with a different angle, and it's not just a copy of Days. The child actors are certainly better, that's for sure. Imogen Poots is definitely an upgrade from Dad from the first film. It was surprising to see Jeremy Renner, Rose Byrne and Idris Elba in this film. I'd forgotten any of them were in it, though their characters aren't particularly memorable, so it's understandable I'd forgotten them. Robert Carlyle is the star here though, and probably the only one with a really interesting backstory. It's a shame that the film's best scene is the opening, but what a great scene. A really exciting and brutal way to begin a film that will get your heart racing. The film really never gets back to that level of tension. But I enjoyed this rewatch, and I'm hoping one day we will get 28 months later. My score for 28 Weeks Later is 7 out of 10. I watched an absolute classic next with Wes Craven's Scream.
What's that noise?
Popcorn.
You making popcorn?
Well, I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
You like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
You never told me your name.
Why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
Not sure how many times I've seen this, but it always manages to completely entertain me. Such a creative film, absolutely chock full of meta self-referencing, red herrings and playful winks to the audience. My favourite being Wes Craven in a cameo as the janitor dressed in Freddy Krueger's clothes. What it does really well too is it doesn't pull any punches with the horror and gore. Although it's goofy, the stakes are always high, and the opening killing of Drew Barrymore is an absolute masterstroke. If the big Hollywood star isn't safe, who is? Most terrifying thing about this film though is Matthew Lillard's tongue. Put it away, man. My score for Scream is 9 out of 10. A massive change of pace and vibe now for film number 11 of my horror week, and a film I wasn't sure if I actually ever wanted to watch a second time. It's Martyrs. difficult film to rate and review, pretty much because it's not an enjoyable way to spend 90 minutes. It does not get more fucked up than this film. Martyrs is brutal, violent, horrific, disturbing, gory, and nasty, but unlike with a lot of extreme French horror that came out around the same time, I'm looking at you inside. There is a point to all the violence, and it's integral to the story, as hard as it is to stomach. This film is about violence and pain and the trauma that these cause. And it depicts trauma, depression, self-harm and suicide in a very clever way, which I imagine could be cathartic to some, although horrifically triggering to others. The one part of this film I genuinely do love though is that ending and how out there it is. The first time I saw this, and I definitely will never watch this again now I've seen it a second time, it left me in quite an odd state for a couple of days, questioning what it all meant and even what it all means. I really hope the two leads got paid handsomely for their work. I'm sure this isn't the case, sadly. One, because they're both incredible, and two, because I think they likely both went through hell to film this film. My score for Martyrs is 8 out of 10. Next up is a film I had pretty much no interest in watching when it was first released, but then Chris Stuckman made a video saying every horror film should give it a chance. So I did. And that film is David Pryor's The Empty Man.
And on the third night?
Well, on the third night he finds you. He finds you.
It feels like there are two camps with this film. One who thinks The Empty Man is trash, and one who thinks it's woefully underrated and harshly maligned. Well, put me in camp number two because I quite enjoyed The Empty Man. Yes, it's far from a perfect film. The plot almost collapses under its own weight and could have been streamlined a lot. Some of the smaller part actors are not wholly convincing, particularly Amanda and Garrett. The score is both overbearing and underwhelming at the same time somehow. And there's a lot of exposition, especially in the conclusion. But this is a brilliantly shot, edited and written film from debut director-writer David Pryor. The Empty Man really is a great looking film, and I'm keen to see what Pryor does next. James Badge Dale does a decent job in the lead role, and I really thought there were quite a few well done creepy sequences in this film. And that long intro was fantastic too. I honestly don't understand the hatred for this film despite its flaws. My score for The Empty Man, 7 out of 10. Next up I watched what I think is probably the first Indonesian horror film I've ever seen with Pengabdi Setan, otherwise known as Satan's Slaves. After dying from a strange illness that she endured for 3 years, a mother returns home to pick up her children. Yeah, this one was just okay for me. I like the vibe of it, and some of the early scares were fairly effective, especially a really great shot involving a bedsheet. Overall though, I found this to be a little tropey, a little seen it all before, and quite repetitive. The supernatural threat diminished the longer the film went on, and I became unengaged. I quite like the overall story, but I'm not sure it was told particularly well. Tighter direction and editing were needed to up the tension here. I could just about recommend this one because it does have some effective scares, just don't expect anything mind-blowing or particularly original. My score for Satan's Slaves is 5.5 out of 10. The penultimate film of my horror week was a rewatch of 2014's It Follows.
This thing, it's gonna follow you. Somebody gave it to me, and I passed it to you.
Though this one didn't quite hit as well on a second watch, still a really well-made horror film. Its super simple premise is both the film's strength and its weakness. This is a short film, but I do think it just about runs out of steam for those last 15 minutes. After I watched this, I saw someone comment on Twitter saying that It Follows is ripe for a sequel, and although I'm surprised it's not happened, I couldn't disagree more. A sequel would only be more of the same, and inevitably less so. There are some A scenes in It Follows though, none better than the tall man who suddenly stomps across the landing into the bedroom. And when I first saw this film, that was an absolute shit kind of moment. The lack of constant exposition and explanation means the menace is always frightening and otherworldly. And best of all, it's a teen horror which is devoid of tropes, pretty much unique. No sequel, please. My score for It Follows is 8 out of 10. For the 15th and final film of my horror week, I watched Mexican fantasy horror, Tigers Are Not Afraid. Tigers Are Not Afraid is a dark fairy tale about a gang of 5 children trying to survive the horrific violence of the cartels and the ghosts created every day by the drug war. This was a strong way to end my horror week. This is a unique fantasy horror with real-life socio-political undertones. The comment I saw on Twitter said this is Pan's Labyrinth mixed with City of God, and you can totally understand why this was one of Guillermo del Toro's favourite films of 2017. It has creepy moments, but it's not a typically scary horror film. It's more frightening to realise that these horrific situations are happening every day in many parts of the world, not just Mexico. The child actors here are absolutely phenomenal, and it's incredible to think that none of them had any acting training. And perhaps that's the secret. Don't give kids training. Tigers Are Not Afraid is a beautiful and unique film, which is easy for me to recommend to all horror fans. My score for Tigers Are Not Afraid is 7.5 out of 10. So that's it, all 15 films I watched across my horror week. Expect more comedy and family drama on the channel over the next few weeks, because I'm not sure if I can take any more scares. I'm just kidding. Thanks for watching.
Game over, man. It's game over.